Imagine moving into your dream home, expecting peace and happiness, only to find that strange voices fill the house at night. Someone crying out loud at 12 midnight, people talking and steadily pounding yam. This is the shocking reality the Adui family faces in their new house in Gabon, turning their dream into a nightmare they never expected. As their children fall mysteriously ill, a restless spirit demands justice, and Conor's deeper secret starts to unravel, putting everything he's worked for at risk. This is a tale of betrayal, guilt, and the inescapable grip of the past. Can the Adui family survive the wrath of the spirits that haunt their home? Or will the truth, once uncovered, tear them apart forever? Find out in this chilling story, and don't forget to subscribe to Savannah Storytime to enjoy more twists and turns of African tales like this. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, golden shadows over the sprawling city of Gabon. The streets were alive with the sounds of distant chatter, the hum of traffic, and the occasional call of a street vendor, but here, in this quiet neighborhood, there was a different kind of stillness. It was the kind of silence that came with old wealth and deep roots, where the air felt thicker, almost as if it held memories of generations past. As the gate to the Adui family's new home swung open, Conor Adui, a man of steady build and steady determination, stepped out of the car. His broad shoulders, the kind that had carried the weight of many burdens, now bore the pride of a man who had climbed the ladder of life with his own hands. Conor was not born into wealth, but through grit and sheer will, he had built a name for himself as a contractor. This house, grand and imposing, stood tall, a colonial masterpiece with towering columns and expansive windows that gazed out like watchful eyes. The whitewashed walls, now bathed in the soft light of the setting sun, gleamed with the promise of new beginnings. This was not just a house, it was a dream brought to life, the kind of place where a man could finally rest, knowing he had provided the very best for his family. Aisha, Conor's wife, emerged from the car with a grace that spoke of both strength and gentleness. She was a woman whose beauty lay not just in her features but in the quiet confidence with which she carried herself. Her long, floral dress fluttered slightly in the evening breeze, a contrast to the solid, unyielding structure of the house before her. She had left behind her career as a teacher when Conor's success had beckoned them to this new life. The children, Tund and Lola, were next to step out. Tund, tall for his age, with a wiry frame and eyes that gleamed with curiosity, immediately felt the pull of the house. He darted forward, eager to explore, his mind already racing with possibilities. Lola, younger and more cautious, hung back. She was a delicate child, with big, expressive eyes that took in the world with a mixture of wonder and wariness. Her small hand clutched a well-worn teddy bear, the kind of companion that had seen her through many a night's fear. The family crossed the threshold together, entering the house that was to become their new home. The air inside was cool, the ceilings were high, the kind that made voices echo slightly, giving the space a sense of grandeur. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting the house in shadows, the Adui family gathered in the living room. The large windows framed the garden outside, now bathed in twilight. Aisha turned to Conor, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "It's beautiful, Conor," she said, her words carrying the weight of all they had sacrificed to be here. "This is where we make new memories, together." Conor nodded, his heart full. He looked around at his family, at the house that was now theirs, and felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. As the deep velvet of night enveloped the old house, the Adui family settled into their first night, the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the structure blending into the background hum of the Gabon cityscape. The house, with its grandiose presence and weather charm, seemed to breathe quietly as the family drifted into sleep, weary from the day's move. Midnight approached with a deceptive stillness, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The ticking of the wall clock marked each second, a metronome to the symphony of silence. But then, just as the clock struck 12, the silence was shattered, not with the clarity of a single sound, but with the strange, overlapping murmur of voices, distant yet distinct. They seemed to rise from the very walls, like whispers from forgotten memories, carrying a weight of sorrow and something unnameable. Aisha was the first to stir, her mother's intuition pricking at the edges of her sleep. She listened, her heart quickening as the murmurs grew louder, joined now by another sound, the steady, rhythmic pounding of yam. It was a familiar sound, one from childhood memories of family gatherings in the village, yet its presence here, in this house, in the dead of night, sent a chill down her spine. Conor, sleeping beside her, grunted softly, turning in his sleep, the weight of the day still heavy on his mind. Aisha gently shook him awake, her voice a whisper tinged with unease. "Conor, do you hear that?" Before he could respond, the voices swelled, as if in response to Aisha's question, and then, piercing through the murmurs, came a cry, sharp, desperate, and undeniably human. It echoed through the corridors, wrapping itself around the family, drawing them from the warmth of their beds into the cold grip of fear. Tom bolted upright in his room, heart racing. Lola whimpered in her sleep, her dreams now invaded by the ghostly sounds. Conor, jolted awake by the cry, shook his head as if to clear it of the remnants of sleep. "It's nothing, it must be from the next house," he muttered, trying to sound convincing, though his own heart was pounding harder than the phantom yam. But Aisha was not so easily soothed. Together, they searched the house, their footsteps tentative, hesitant, as if expecting the walls to close in on them at any moment. Room by room, they moved, checking locks, peering into corners, but each space they entered was silent, the noises retreating just out of reach, like shadows at the edge of a flickering candle. When they finally regrouped in the hallway, the tension was palpable. The family returned to their beds, but sleep did not come easily. The house, once a symbol of their new beginning, now felt like a place of secrets, of memories that refused to stay buried. And as they lay in the darkness, the murmurs faded to silence, leaving behind only questions, and the feeling that they were not alone. The weeks that followed were a blur of growing unease for the Adui family. Each night, as the clock struck midnight, the once comforting walls of their new home echoed with unsettling sounds, murmurs of voices, the faint sobbing of an unseen presence, and that persistent, rhythmic pounding of yam. It was as if the house itself had a pulse, one that throbbed with a disturbing vitality, unnerving everyone who dared to listen. For Ton and Lola, the terror was more than just a fleeting discomfort. It seeped into their very beings, manifesting in ways that Aisha could neither understand nor explain. Ton, once vibrant and full of energy, began to pale, his usual sharpness dulled by a fever that clung to him like a shadow. He tossed and turned at night, caught in the throes of nightmares that left him drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. Lola, too, was not spared. The young girl, usually so full of life and laughter, became withdrawn, her bright spirit dimmed by an overwhelming sense of dread. She clung to her mother, her small body trembling with a fear she could not articulate. Aisha's concern deepened with each passing day. She tried to keep calm, reassuring herself that it was just the stress of the move, the adjustment to a new environment. But the evidence of her children's suffering was undeniable. Their declining health gnawed at her, a relentless worry that festered in her heart. She busied herself with remedies, consulting doctors who offered no clear answers, only vague suggestions, and prescribed medicines that seemed to have no effect. But it was the phone call from the hospital that shattered the fragile calm Aisha had tried so desperately to maintain. It came late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning its descent, casting long, ominous shadows across the house. The voice on the other end was clinical, detached, delivering news that sent a cold spike of fear through her chest. "Ton has taken a turn for the worse," the doctor said. He's not responding to treatment as we had hoped. Aisha's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. She clutched the phone tightly, her mind racing to comprehend the words that felt too surreal to be true. "What do you mean he's not responding to treatment?" she demanded, her voice trembling with the edge of panic. "He was fine just yesterday." The answer offered no comfort, only a stark reality that left Aisha reeling. As the phone slipped from her grasp, her world tilted, the weight of her fear and helplessness crashing down upon her. The house, once a symbol of their fresh start, now felt like a trap, a place where the unseen forces at work were slowly tightening their grip on her family, drawing them into a nightmare from which there seemed no escape. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon when Aunt Mareo, Conor's distant aunt, arrived at the Adui household, her presence immediately infusing the space with a warmth that only she could bring. She was a woman of substance, known for her wisdom and deep connection to the old ways, and her arrival brought a small measure of relief to Aisha and the children. That night, as the house fell into silence, Aunt Mareo prepared to retire, whispering a prayer for protection before sleeping under the heavy quilt. She had not been asleep for long when the first sound reached her ears, a soft, pitiful cry that seemed to rise from the very floor beneath her. She bolted upright, heart pounding, as the cries grew louder, filling the room with a sorrow so deep it threatened to pull her under. Panic set in as she realized that this was no ordinary disturbance. She jumped out of bed, her feet barely touching the ground as she scrambled to gather her belongings. She had to leave, had to get out of this house before the spirits, whatever they were, could claim her. But as she reached the front door, her hands trembling with fear, she found that it would not budge. No matter how hard she pulled, how desperately she turned the lock, the door remained steadfastly shut. Sweat beaded on her forehead as the cries grew more frantic, almost mocking her attempts to escape. Aunt Mareo's hands shook as she tried to open the windows, but they too refused to give way, sealed as if by some unseen force. The house had become a prison, and she was its unwilling captive. "This house is cursed," she muttered to herself, the words stumbling out in a frantic whisper. In the darkness, with the house closing in around her, Aunt Mareo did the only thing she knew how: she prayed. She prayed to all the gods she ever knew. But even as she recited the old prayers, beads of sweat rolling down her face, she could feel the presence in the house watching her, waiting. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity, until finally, the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains. As the sun's rays touched the house, the cries ceased abruptly, leaving behind a deafening silence. The door, which had refused to open all night, suddenly gave way with a creak, as if the house had released its hold on her. Without a moment's hesitation, Aunt Mareo gathered her things and fled, not daring to look back. She could still feel the weight of the night on her shoulders as she stepped outside, the cool morning air a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere she had just escaped. But even as she hurried away, one thought burned in her mind: she could not, would not, leave her family to face this alone. Whatever was haunting the house would have to be dealt with. And she knew just the person to help. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the Adui household, the air grew thick with tension. Aunt Mareo, determined and resolute, returned to the house with Baba Adegbite, a figure of both mystery and reverence. Baba Adegbite was known back in the village for his deep understanding of the spiritual world and his ability to commune with the ancestors. The family, huddled together in fear and desperation, watched as Baba Adegbite began his work. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who had performed these rituals many times, yet his furrowed brow betrayed the seriousness of what he was about to uncover. With deliberate motions, Baba Adegbite laid out his tools, cowrie shells and a small carved figure representing the ancestral spirits. His chants, low and rhythmic, filled the room. Then, as if summoned by the incantations, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The air became heavy, oppressive, and the presence of something otherworldly became undeniable. Baba Adegbite stopped chanting, his eyes narrowing as he sensed the spirit's arrival. The family gasped in unison as a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles in a single breath. In the darkness, the figure of Femi, Conor's dead brother, appeared. His form was shadowy, but his presence was overwhelming. There was no mistaking the anger, the hurt, the deep, seething resentment that radiated from him. He did not speak, yet his demand was clear: justice. Conor and Aunt Mariel both recognized him instantly, their faces paling as the reality of what they were witnessing settled in. The years had not diminished the sharpness of Femi's features in their memories, and now, seeing him before them, they were struck by the intensity of his unresolved rage. The shock was palpable, and for a moment, even Baba Adegbite's steady hand faltered, acknowledging the gravity of the spirit's presence. Baba Adegbite, unflinching, turned to Conor, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "There is a spirit here," he said, his words slicing through the tension like a knife. "One that will not rest until the truth is revealed. We must also find his remains in this house, or it will follow you everywhere you go, even if you travel outside the country." The living room, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt like the epicenter of something ancient and unforgiving. Darkness clung to the corners, and even the bravest among them could not shake the feeling of impending doom. The family gathered around Baba Adegbite, their faces pale with fear, as the spirit of Femi grew more distinct, his form now almost fully visible, a tortured echo of the man he had once been. Femi's eyes, hollow and burning with unspoken rage, bore into Conor. There was no escape, no more hiding. Conor's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the secret he had buried so deep, thinking it would never resurface. But here it was, brought to life by the very house he had hoped would be his new beginning. The weight of his guilt, the lies he had told to cover up his crime, crushed him under their force. Finally, under the relentless gaze of his brother's spirit, Conor broke. His voice trembled as he began to speak, the words spilling out like poison. "Femi and I, we left the village together," he confessed, each word dragging him deeper into the past. "We found work as laborers in the city. It was hard and grueling, we were both desperate. One day, we had a quarrel over money, over pride, I can't even remember, but it got out of hand." His voice cracked, the memory too painful to bear. The family watched in horror, unable to believe what they were hearing, as Conor continued, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to kill him," he sobbed, the truth finally ripping free from his chest. "But I did. In a moment of madness, I struck him, and he fell. And then I buried him in secret, reported him missing to the police, and I thought it was over. If his remains are in this house, then this place must be where we worked as laborers at that time. That's more than 20 years ago." Conor's confession hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The spirit of Femi stood motionless, absorbing the words he had long waited to hear. But there was no peace in his gaze, no forgiveness. The house, this cursed place, was built over the very spot where Femi's life had been stolen, and now, that same ground demanded retribution. As the truth settled over the room like a dark cloud, Aunt Mariel's voice cut through the thick silence, trembling with fear and realization. "When the news came that Femi was missing and later presumed dead, we thought it was the work of an enemy. In our grief and anger, we placed a curse on his spirit, that he would never rest until he had avenged his death by killing those responsible." Her words hung in the air, adding a new layer of horror to the already overwhelming situation. Aunt Mariel's eyes widened as the weight of what she had just confessed sunk in. "We didn't know, we didn't realize, it was you, Conor." Her voice faltered. Conor collapsed to his knees, the full weight of his actions crashing down on him. "I buried him here, thinking I could hide my shame, but it has followed me," he choked out, the finality of his words sealing his fate. The air in the house had thickened, as though it held its breath, waiting. Each passing hour seemed to draw the life out of the walls. Femi's spirit disappeared, leaving behind a chilling stillness that gnawed at the nerves. In the midst of this oppressive silence, the phone rang, its sharp tone slicing through the air like a blade. Aisha's hands shook as she answered, her heart already plummeting with a premonition of doom. The words from the other end of the line were garbled, a cruel distortion of reality, but their meaning was unmistakable. Turned, their bright, inquisitive boy, was gone. The life that had once burned so fiercely in his young eyes had been extinguished, snuffed out by forces that none of them could see or understand. Aisha's knees buckled beneath her, and she crumpled to the floor, her body racked with sobs that tore from her throat like an animal in pain. "No, not Tond, not my son," she cried, her voice cracking under the weight of her grief. As if the news of Tond's death wasn't enough, the doctor's voice continued, cold and clinical, delivering the second blow. Lola was also fighting for her life, her tiny body racked with the same inexplicable illness that had claimed her brother. The fragile thread that held Conor's world together was unraveling, each strand snapping with a painful finality that left him hollow and broken. Conor stood there, his body rigid and his face a mask of shock and horror. The realization of his culpability in this unfolding nightmare crashed down on him with unbearable force. To find the exact point where Femi was buried, Baba Adegbite began his rites, his voice low and resonant, chanting words that carried the weight of tradition. This led them outside, at the very center of the compound. "This is the exact spot," Baba Adegbite said. As the herbalist walked, the earth in the compound was slowly unearthed, revealing the skeletal remains of Femi, Conor's brother, whose life had been unjustly cut short. The sight of Femi's remains was both a release and a curse. Conor's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a painful reminder of the life he had taken, the brother he had betrayed. The realization that this pitiful heap of bones was all that was left of his brother was almost too much to bear. But bear it he must, for there was no escaping the truth now. Baba Adegbite's voice cut through the silence as he completed the final rites, his stone grave. "He will rest now, but the price of your actions has been paid, Conor." The ritual was complete, but the toll it had taken on the living was irreversible. The whole house, now eerily quiet, seemed to exhale a long-held breath. But the peace that followed was not one of relief, it was a somber, hollow peace, one that carried the weight of loss and the bitter taste of retribution. The following day, Lola lay in the hospital bed, her small frame engulfed by white sheets, battling for every breath as machines beeped rhythmically beside her. Aisha's heart ached with an intensity that threatened to consume her. Tond was gone, snatched away by a force they could neither see nor fight. And now, Lola teetered on the edge, her young life hanging by a thread. The weight of it all pressed down on Aisha, making it hard to breathe. She had sacrificed everything to support Conor, her job, her stability, her peace. But now, all she saw was a man whose past had torn their family apart. She couldn't stay. Not here. Not in that cursed house where secrets festered and spirits lingered. She needed to protect what little remained of her family, to shield Lola from the ghost of Conor's sins. The decision settled in her heart like a stone, heavy and irrevocable. Back at the mansion, as she packed the few belongings she could carry, a single suitcase barely containing the remnants of their shattered lives, Conor's phone rang. He answered, and with each passing second, his face drained of color. The voice on the other end delivered the final blow, the dream contract, the one that had brought him to Gabon and uprooted their lives, was gone. Cancelled. Conor's world crumbled in an instant. The weight of it was visible in the slump of his shoulders, the trembling of his hands, the vacant look in his eyes. Everything he had worked for, and sacrificed for, was gone, his career, his son, and now, his wife and daughter. Aisha stood at the door, suitcase in hand, her expression unreadable but resolute. Her voice, though soft, cut through the stillness with a finality that was unmistakable. I cannot stay, Conor. I have to protect Lola. This house, this life. I can't bear it anymore. With those words, she turned and walked out, leaving Conor to face the ruins of what once was. The door closed behind her, the sound echoing like the toll of a death knell. The house was silent now, eerily so, as if it too mourned the loss of the lives it had once sheltered. Conor stood alone in the vast emptiness, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a physical force. I thought I could escape the past, he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible in the oppressive stillness. But it has taken everything. I have nothing left but this silence. Conor walked through the house one last time, each step heavy with the realization that he had nothing left. His career, his family, his future, everything had been taken from him by the very silence he had once thought would protect him. Thank you for joining us on this journey with the Adui family, a story where the past refuses to stay buried, and secrets come back to haunt. If you were as captivated by this tale as we were, make sure to give this video a thumbs up. And remember, the world is full of stories like this, rich with culture, filled with twists, and always leaving you wanting more. So, don't forget to subscribe to Savannah Storytime, where we bring you more intriguing African tales. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep the stories alive.